Every time now, the computer's getting a little bit slower. I think they have so much junk on here. Reminds me of the U2. Okay, well, raise your hand if you're here. Let's keep it up for the rest of the period. Let's see what kind of stamina we have. So Owen is gone. Devin is gone.
Yeah.
I thought Devin was coming back. All right, here we go. Victory. All right. So, what was I going to tell you? Oh, we're going to test on Tuesday, and I'll give you hints on the short IDs. I'm looking right now at 3 to perhaps 4 short IDs and 25 multiple choice. So you should be done relatively fast. I think maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes. Let's go 5 full minutes. 5 minutes. Yes. Yeah. I said I'd do it Monday. I didn't want to test on Monday. And I wanted to cover some of these things in a little more detail, so I just figured what that. And just to review from yesterday, Jacksonian, the election of 1824, what did they call the deal? The correct bargain. And Henry Clay would become what?
Secretary.
Yeah. And who would become president? And Adams looks vaguely like a what? Salamander. Yeah. See, we learned something in here. And bullfrog, kind. All right, we got to do this one more time.
Oh my God.
Salamander, come on. Oh, so did we get through? We got all the way through this, right? We can start this. And what was the name that the anti-Jackson elites gave democracy? King Mob. What's the other one? King Numbers, which is such a it's a very descriptive name. Democracy to Jacksonian Democrats, democracy is equal to what? The people have what? And sovereignty means power. And who got the right to vote? Yeah, the common man, but we're talking about, this literally was white men, because those were people of European descent, because those were considered the citizens. It's a slow step, but also a big step. It's one of those weird things looking back historically. Also, who did the Jacksonian Democrats fear? What people? Yes.
Just real quick, so I was thinking about this, like, you know how like we were kind of like de-evolving, I guess, in rights with like more like racism and like stuff like that, and like women lost a lot of rights. Did that happen like all over or just in America?
All over, yeah, all over. Different degrees, different styles, and in other places, women could not vote at all before because they didn't have the vote. No one would. But still, women lost economic power wherever the Industrial Revolution began. Yeah. So it would ripple across the West. But every place is different, unique in its own nature. And one of the amazing things, like for example, racism got significantly more intense after the Civil War, because now all of a sudden there are free people, and that's so. It's kind of it has this kind of a way. What group did they fear? Jacksonian Democrats. This cabal of whom? Yes. Yeah, this Eastern elites represented by what body? Yeah, so I've heard a few people, the bus. And got numbers. Oh, what do they call that? Giving jobs? What's the name for the term I gave you for giving government jobs? Patronage. Close. Partridge. Yes, it's partridge. Patronage. When my wife and I've been to the South, but there's a lot of patronage without the part. And so we would go there, and all these people would say, "Oh, okay, nice to meet you, Mr. Patridge." They would always have, many times that's happened to me, so, Mr. Patronage. Okay, so with that, and what do they call that, giving the government jobs to political supporters? Yeah, that's, the victor goes to spoil, the spoil system. And that's both good and bad. I mean, it's one of those things, there's no easy answer to a lot of this. So we went through, did we get all the way to, how did we go?
Yeah.
Did we get to this?
No.
So those are the people who made it up. The bulk of them dropped mice. I mean, by the way, I wonder why I break these things. You throw one of these down the hall, they really shatter. They don't make mouses like they used to. By the way, that's actually very hard to say. Mouses. I know. So, meese is good. Meese are good. Wouldn't it be meese are good? Another one is overheads. They break really easy too. So, the bulk of this are going to be capitalists and bankers, but also the big plantation owners. At first, the plantation owners thought Jackson was an ally because he was a plantation owner. As it turned out, no, Jackson actually did believe this whole democracy thing. They didn't like that at all. They abandoned Jackson pretty fast. Especially, who was Jackson's vice president? Who? John C. Calhoun. And some churches, mostly these new Protestant churches that fit with a Protestant work ethic of the Second Great Awakening, but there's a lot of workers that seem to be more ideally part of the democracy. That's part of the reason why they didn't like the vote. But then eventually the Whigs will realize, well, it's too late for that. We got to figure out a way to persuade them to join us. Which they would come up with incredibly good ways. Shock the Democrats. So with that, there's Jackson on his way to Washington, D.C. A very stylized picture of him talking on his carriage on the way. Not that it was like this, but he went back home, most of it by train. That's how much the world changed when he left. When he left office. Everything was just being turned upside down. And here's the inauguration, and this was considered the people's inauguration. Hundreds of people came to go see Jackson being inaugurated. It was like, our president, one of us. You know, Jefferson tried to act like he was a commoner. Jackson really was. And so all these people came in and they stormed the executive mansion, which had just been rebuilt. And they're running through the halls. They had big barrels of whiskey and hard cider. And they were running through, climbing out windows. And of course, you can imagine the elite were saying, look what happens when you elect a commoner. And then in the foyer of the executive mansion, they had a big block of, well, what food represents democracy? Yes. Cheese. They had a massive block of cheese in the middle of the foyer, and they would cut it out and they're running through the White House. I just have this idea of them running through with a big, like a wooden cup of hard cider and cheese makes me laugh. Right? Cheese. Someone actually did say cheese. Did you know this, or just was it a great guess? Because you're a small D Democrat. You believe in democracy.
Yeah, I was thinking of like those huge ones, like huge, and they're like rolling it through the house, and just like a giant baby bell.
Very well done. So, and it's all kinds of cheese. I mean, even Munster. Okay, so Munster cheese. Gouda is good. I do like good cheddar. Aged cheddar. I got to be honest, I like cheese a lot. Guess what I had for dinner? Grilled cheese. Okay, so we're going to skip to Tocqueville and we're going to get right to. And so Jackson, even though it was unclear, he knew he wanted to protect this idea of the common man. And this real idea was the Constitution has all these limits, but also it is democratic, and the Constitution is full of contradictions. And to them, the Constitution should not limit democracy. A few moneyed elite should not have all the power because of the Constitution. And don't forget, that was a big element of why the Constitution was written. And the way it's written is, there's so many barriers between the people and the government. And the Jackson Democrats are saying the Constitution is flexible enough to represent the people. And there'd be three big issues that to Jacksonians would represent their commitment to democracy and the common man. And it's sometimes hard to see out of this because the horrific example of Indian removal was also seen by the Jacksonian Democrats as protecting the lives of the American Indians while at the same time opening up land for common man. I'll explain. Nullification, this crisis would save the Union. It would not have made it, and then the war against the Mutts. This would represent Jackson's commitment to the common man. No, it is not always perfect. It is flawed, and we can say, wait a second, that doesn't make sense, especially with Indian removal. And the answer is, you're right. But I'm also trying to tell you that that's what Jackson was thinking. So, by the way, very urbane. Does he look good? Don't you like the hat? That was a little creepy there. There, he always had that look. And remember, he was always in kind of pain. Always in pain. Bullets inside of him. He had a hard life. He basically couldn't eat. I think I told you this. He basically couldn't eat his last 10 years. Just couldn't eat.
How did he survive 10 years?
Just he a little bit of food, and then his painkiller was whiskey, which is not a healthy thing, obviously, and it wasn't done for any kind of like enjoyment. It was painkiller. There's part of the reason why he was so hungry. He was always in pain. Speaking of that, my back kind of knows. So let's get to Indian removal. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and by trying to explain this, I'm not trying to diminish this horrific event that's going to happen. But there's been a lot of myths about this. And here's the thing about what Jackson is. Jackson really saw himself as the protector of American Indians, as seen by this very creepy picture of him like the father with the American Indians. Now, this is also kind of mocking him, because behind, this is essentially Lady Liberty standing on top of, it's supposed to be like the founding fathers. But he saw themselves as the protector. In fact, he adopted a Cherokee boy, and he saw this as a great thing. He did not quite treat him as an equal son, but that's another story. So let's get to what was going on here. By the 1820s, there was this talk of what do we do about, and this is such a horrific term, but they called it the Indian problem. The Indian problem. What is an Indian problem? What do we do about the remaining American Indians here? They were defeated at Tippecanoe. They were defeated in Horseshoe Bend. But they're here. Not a lot, but they're here, and they have land. A lot of them have signed treaties saying this is their land. In fact, almost all have. Well, the United States wants this land. And Jackson wants to open this up for small farmers. Now, the thought was maybe someday they can assimilate. Does anybody know what assimilation means? Yes?
Like, become one.
Yeah, kind of like join the culture of the United States. Become like small farmers or have plantations or things like that. Someday, in fact, that's what Jefferson said, someday. But they're not ready now. And that's why we got to push them across the Mississippi. Remember, that's why Jefferson wanted the Louisiana Purchase. Now, if anybody knows anything about 20th century American history, this should give you the creeps. It's actually really scary that this term was used. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So World War II began in 1939, and Germany in 1939 took most of Poland, the Soviets took the other half. But by 1941, Germany controlled all of this, a big part of the Soviet Union. Almost all the Jews in the world lived in Poland or the Soviet Union. And as they thought we're in the middle of total war, what do we do about the Jews, this enemy within the areas we conquer? AKA, what do they call it? The Jewish problem. And that's where you lead to what's going to happen there. And that's why it's like, to my ears, I can't help it. That's what I hear, and I think it's important to lay out that there are, unfortunately, these kind of weird parallels in history. And so, with that, here's the thing, though. This is land for the common man. But not only that, if you open up land, more land, cheap land, for sale for small farmers, what will that do to wages in these first textile mills? If they have cheaper land here, it will raise wages, because that will allow here people to say, I hate this horrible job, I'm going to move to Illinois. And so this, to Jackson's point of view, this will help wage earners. Which, yes, if you have a job and you have other options, that really changes your attitude towards the job, doesn't it? You can demand higher wages because you have another choice. If you have no choice, you got to accept the wage that's there. So, what a horrific situation. By the way, did they mean this, that someday they'll assimilate? No, I mean, they all said it. They all said it. It's like, it could be one of those things where, yeah, that'd be nice, but let's be honest, we want the land. And so, in 1830, Congress passed, with Jackson's support, the Indian Removal Act. Now, this act did not force American Indians who live here to move. It just set up the system to allow states. This is all about in states. States make the decisions. But if states decide they want to remove the tribes that live here, it will set up the system to allow them, with the help of the Army would actually set it up, to move them to here. So the states make the decision to force them westward. And they would call this area Indian Territory. It was originally the states of Kansas, or now it's Kansas and Oklahoma. Soon it would just be Oklahoma. By the way, Oklahoma is a heck of a lot different than the American Southeast. In Oklahoma, slightly different terrain, slightly different rainfall. I mean, it shows you that there. Whatever life you're out there will be totally different in Oklahoma. I'm not bashing Oklahoma for that. Let me tell you how bad Oklahoma is. But this is all about states. So this is not the federal government telling people to move. The states do it, then the federal government will facilitate it. It's a very complex, weird law. Why is it done that way? Because the federal government at that time still believed, and virtually everybody would have agreed, they had no power over existing states. So they can't force it. The states still have sovereignty. Remember, what is the term where you have separate national government and then state government? Yes, that's federalism. Now today it's not quite as cut and dry, but then it was, that's state. The federal government has power over the territories. And so they could set up this. By the way, yes, there are people living there like the Kiowa or the Comanche, but they're just going to move in. Don't mess with the Comanche. Well, there are 5 tribes of the Southeast that were the most powerful ones who lived in this beautiful mountain valley. Now, they have been, for the most part, defeated. The Choctaw and the Creek were the 2 most powerful. And remember, the Creek were defeated at Horseshoe Bend by one Andrew Jackson. The Chickasaw and the Seminole were a relatively new tribe. And then the Cherokee. They're called civilized because these are tribes that were trying to assimilate into, as what they saw, the culture of the United States and the economy of the United States. So, these are the tribes of the focus. There are many other tribes, but they're smaller and less powerful. Basically, if these 5 tribes here can be coerced to leave, that will force the other smaller tribes out. We don't have a choice with that. Does that make sense? So the states have got to decide. And what got the ball rolling? Gold was discovered in northwest Georgia. The beautiful mountains of northwest Georgia. I think you can imagine what's going to happen. They wanted the people who lived there off that land. And who lived in northwest Georgia? The Cherokee. So, once this happened and Georgia began efforts to remove the Cherokee, the same thing's going to happen every place from Florida up all the way up to Michigan. The Cherokee, though, were the most civilized. They adopted, as they saw, many parts of the United States culture to try to justify them keeping their land, which they had by treaty. They even developed their own language. This is the Cherokee script, developed by a man by the name of Sequoyah, who they would have newspapers in this, written contracts with the idea of being, see, look, we have our own language. Many of them also would adopt English and try to adapt and even take English names. They had farms, cities, the cities based upon not their model, but a European model. They even had what they thought was the most civilized thing you could have. Slaves. So there were plantation owners that were Cherokee with slaves. And so, did this matter though? No, they wanted the land. And once gold was discovered, this set the ball rolling for every place. Well, the Cherokees tried to sue, saying you can't force us out. And there are going to be two cases to the Marshall Court. The first one is the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And it said, no, Georgia doesn't have this power because the Cherokee Nation is a nation within the United States because they signed a treaty. So it's domestic in the borders. They're not totally independent. That's why they have the term dependent nation. They're within the United States, but they have signed a treaty, so they have certain rights on their land by treaty. I about said reservation, but that term wasn't used yet. And in Worcester versus Georgia, the next year, they clarified this by saying Cherokee law is, remember that word for power, sovereign. And you notice that today, this is the precedent today. Okay, there are 7 reservations in Montana, and those of you who've been on reservations or been around them know that the reservations have different laws than the state laws. Different rules, different organization, and that stems from Worcester versus Georgia and Cherokee versus Georgia. So these laws still have precedent. And yeah, so when I was a little kid growing up, the two things I can remember about this, because I was very broad focused as a little kid. They banned a bunch of fireworks for a short time. And virtually all fireworks were banned for a while. And you could buy fireworks on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And the other thing I remember is my college job was delivering beer. And the Northern Cheyenne Reservation was still is a dry reservation. But some very duplicitous, pretty shady, kind of scummy businessmen start open bars just on the edge of the reservation for obvious reasons, and we deliver beer. I've done moving trucks. But that stands for there. John Ross was elected, in essence, the head, or they call him the president of the Cherokee Nation, and he adopted an English name, even though he was a Cherokee. Now, here's the problem. First off, fine. They made a decision, but it's unclear if they apply. The Marshall Court was federal. It's he, the Supreme Court, that's what I should have put down, but he also has the Marshall Court generic. Do they have authority over the states? And that was a real question. They had already passed Fletcher versus Peck that said they did, but virtually nobody believed that. The belief was the Supreme Court, the Marshall Court, did not have power over the states. So, fine, in the territories, this is Georgia, and Georgia decides. Now today, most would say that is wrong, that the Supreme Court does have the power, but back then, no. Now I remember being told this as a student, you'll see this in textbooks, he almost certainly did not say it. It's implied that Jackson just simply ignored the will of the Supreme Court, and everyone, I've been told this many times, you still see this. John Marshall has made his decision, but you notice I have the line through it. He did not say that. It was not that cut and dry. Jackson was just simply like, whatever, the Marshall Court, John Marshall, they made their decision in the Supreme Court, fine. But that doesn't apply to Georgia. So it was more complex than simply saying they ignored the Supreme Court. So what happened? Once it was clear this is a state matter, and that's what the federal government believes, the various tribes are going to be forced into treaties. Every tribe. They realize the jig is up, we can't resist, the power of the United States is coming. So we're going to move. So they'd be forcibly ejected. And you're going to see this with every tribe along here. The Cherokees would hold out for a very long time, arguing, we got the court, this is our land, we signed a treaty, where virtually everybody else would move, would be forced to move to here. The Seminole resisted, and there was actually a military expedition called the Second Seminole War. And the Seminoles, some were forced to move, a lot hid in the Everglades, and they never officially surrendered to this day. They resisted, but there was just a few who did. This is one of the sad legacy of the United States, and it's not just those tribes. Therefore, you can imagine what's going to happen. It affected all of these groups. The remnants of those tribes in the north from the Tippecanoe, those who did not flee west already would be forced to move, and here all moved. The Sauk and the Fox right here they fought as hard as they could, but they're just a couple thousand total. In fact, that's where Abraham Lincoln would become elected officer in his militia. To put down the Sauk and the Fox and force them here. And then someone moved up into Kansas, and then they were forcibly moved down to what is now Oklahoma a little bit later on. But the Cherokee resisted. Now, one more thing about this. Jackson, though, when he looked at this, he said, I'm protecting them. I'm protecting the American Indians. Even though anywhere from 10 to 20% of those tribes here would die along the horrible path there. There's no basic roads, but I'm protecting them. Why would he justify this by saying he's protecting them? Did he do this in personal experience? This is what he looked at. As he saw, we only have two choices. We forcibly move them, or they stay and resist, and what's going to happen? The United States will kill them all. He knows that from what happened at Tippecanoe, Horseshoe Bend, and all these other battles. Now, of course, there was a third option. They had the land and figure out a way to coexist, because that was kind of the situation they're in by 1830. They didn't even consider that. Not at all. But what are the Cherokees? They would fight the longest. And then finally, in the winter of 1838, 1839, they were forcibly removed. And you notice it was winter. And Georgia was desperate to get them out. Jackson's no longer president. It's Martin Van Buren. But they're forcibly removed. The Army, absolutely unprepared for this. Partially because it was winter, and they assumed it would not happen until the next year. They were much better prepared in the summer of 38, but it didn't happen. So in the bitterly cold winter, there wasn't proper food, other stories laid out. And this was pure, unadulterated negligence, but was it more than that? And this is something that has come through. Was it negligence or was it on purpose? And in the 20th century, you have people call this a term from the 20th century that would come out of World War I. That I didn't type in. How did that move? What's going on here? Why are you doing that? I don't want that. All right, I hate when it does stuff like that. They did a bunch of updates on all the Microsoft stuff, and they're all messed up and they're not working. So let me get rid of this. In the 20th century, this would be referred to as, why is it doing this? Okay. I don't want this. I have no idea why it's doing this. That's really annoying. Are you as annoyed as I am?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can tell you're very sincere.
This is an outrage.
So, this is going to be called in the 20th century, some people refer to it as genocide. And genocide is, we'll give more definition of this, but the purposeful killing state-sponsored killing of an ethnic group or religious group of a certain type of people. But a more appropriate term would be found, and would be used in the 1990s in a country that used to be called Yugoslavia. And it was called ethnic cleansing, where you literally force a group of people to move out at gunpoint, knowing that many of them will die along the way, basically give them the choice, death or move. And that's what this was. And that's probably closer to the way it was. So, was this negligence part of it? It's more like, it just fit with the practice of, we're gonna move them and we don't care. It's a better way to look at it. Genocide is probably it's a little more complex than that. Ethnic cleansing is probably a better word for this. But this was not the federal government, this was Georgia. This was not the federal government 100%, and Jackson was long gone. But why? Oh, this is going to drive me nuts. I touched nothing. You don't. They're finally out to get me. They finally got me. And what did you people do? Nothing. You let it happen. So, the opposition by the Whigs opposed Indian removal. And yes, there were some humanitarian concerns, but also it was very political. There'll be more Democrats. They thought more Democratic states here, more people move in, and we'll lose political power. So the Whigs, it was a lot of it, we just don't want more Democrats. Here's an anti-Jackson cartoon. Jackson leading this caravan proclaiming, we care about the rights for all men. That was the cry of the common man. But what's happening in cages, there are the various tribes, and who's also part of the procession with Jackson? The devil. And I love how he's playing a fiddle, like playing the tune for them to march. Yeah.
Are these quotations up there on purpose? Is it Whig opposition or is it Whig opposition?
For what?
Is it Whig opposition or is it Whig opposition? Like, are the quotes there on purpose?
Oh, I don't know why.
That's why
I'm not finished. The quote will end later on.
Oh.
I made that up.
So,
It's a mistake.
okay.
I should have another quote here. The whole thing was opposition. The point was that it might not have been the most humanitarian opposition. By the way, balloons became a big deal. And so you see all these pictures with balloons in them. Because that's crazy technology. And by the way, with that kind of technology of balloons, are we going to harness that for good? Are you with me on that? Or will balloons be used for evil? That's a valid question, right? So, while this is going on, back in D.C., and remember, Washington, D.C., nobody lives here. Members of Congress come into Washington, D.C., and as soon as the legislative term is done, they get out. And so as we... I look at your faces, I knew it's switched screens, isn't it? By the way, this never happened either. Whatever they change with the screen makes it so much easier to flip back and forth. Once again, part of the plot against me that you're doing nothing to stop. And you're either with me or you're with the enemy.
Still want to see an assassin.
We have to practice that again. So, all the social events are going to be with just a few members of the cabinet and people there. And what's going to be called the Eaton malaria. The Secretary of War, John Eaton, married Peggy O'Neill. Peggy Eaton. Well, Peggy Eaton was a divorcee. But not only that, she worked in grab your desk, a tavern. Now, some of you are saying that, but to people at that time, the woman who worked in the tavern was probably a what? A prostitute. Now, that's garbage, but that's what they said. She's a divorcee and a prostitute. Look what happens when you allow those commoners into their homes. And does it remind you of who's Jackson's wife? Isn't this just like the Rachel story? So we got married, and this became known as the pedigreed affair. And it was all about class. The elite, the aristocracy, those who had inherited wealth, who saw themselves as superior in Jackson's cabinet, they refused to socialize with Jackson, or with Eatons. Not Jackson, Jackson didn't care. But with the Eatons, they ostracized them. They mocked him, they made fun, it became a class issue. And the story came out that at the so-called wedding or introduction of Peggy O'Neill to soon-to-be Peggy Eaton to Jackson, she did a very risque dance for him. How do you know it's risque? Ankles. Do you see the ankles? Yeah, I was a little worried I should show you this, but I showed you this to let you know how scandalous. By the way, this is just pure class. Look at those poor people. Nobody ostracized them more than these two right here. Who's that? John D. Calhoun and his wife Flora. Yes, I'm not kidding. His wife is named Flora. Jackson already hated Calhoun, and Calhoun was growing to hate Jackson. When Calhoun realized Jackson isn't this great supporter of big plantations and power of the plantation owners. Jackson actually believed in democracy, at least for some people. Well, which is still a big step. It's one of those complex issues. So Jackson in fury, and this split the cabinet apart. So during this fight, a new crisis came up, the Nullification Crisis. Now sometimes you see this called the Tariff War. But the tariff, it's really nullification. And here's Jackson, and I spread this out so you could really see neck hair. I know, it's kind of, it's pretty cool, isn't it?
It makes me so uncomfortable you wouldn't believe. Like if I saw that walking down the street, I'd scream and run. Like no, just
Enjoy? I saw neck hair.
no,
Okay.
neck hair is disgusting.
So remember the big tariff of abominations? This really big tariff in 1828? Actually, the Democrats wanted that cut. So almost immediately when Jackson became president, they're talking about cutting this. So there's a talk about this. But Calhoun was already furious about the tariff, which is interesting because 12 years earlier, he supported the tariff. But everything changed. So Calhoun had a vision. A vision. Calhoun wrote in 1828 as Adams's vice president, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. I know it's an awful word, you're awfully long. And it's essentially saying, hey, let's nullify the tariff. We're going to say the tariff is an unconstitutional tax on the states. Now, for precedent, they went back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions about nullifying the Alien and Sedition Act, way back in those heady days of 1798. Who wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions? Madison and Jefferson. And so they set the time bomb off. They set the stage for the end of the Republic. No, they did not want that. This is the problem when you play chicken. You try to bully somebody else. What if they call your bluff? I can only imagine if Jackson was not president, there'd be no union with this. Now, Calhoun didn't want to end the union, but he's thinking of preserving the union for a union with what? Slavery. And tariff was the excuse to protect slavery. Has everyone got that? Tariff was the excuse. So let's go through what he wanted, his vision. Number one, what's his vision? Okay, let's get to the basic anti-tariff arguments. The South has no industry to protect. It's a beautiful, pristine mountain scene. So last year it would have popped up, at least it would have popped up either a picture of one of 3 concerts I went to the past few years. They won't let me change it. That's what I've been complaining about this whole, haven't I complained to you people about this?
Yes.
Complaining and what? You're trying to hide somebody's part of this whole mess.
Oh my God, it changed again. It changed, Jesus Christ.
And you take glee from this. My pain. We could be seeing the Rolling Stones or Paul McCartney or Green Day or something. Okay, so. Well, what happened was, if you put a tax on cotton, they won't sell as much because that will raise the price for cotton. And so the textile mills in either here or Britain will drop their demand. So this is an attack on the South. They have no industry to protect. Price of cotton goes up, demand for cotton will go down. Demand for textiles will go down. Number two, in a tariff, all prices go up, and the money will go to the north. So they said this will suck the wealth out of the South to the north. Here's the thing about tariffs. Tariffs raise all prices. And that's the plan. So let me show you how it works. Now I'm going to use very basic math, and you notice the remnants of a tic-tac-toe board here. So just imagine we have the price of British textiles. Imagine a 10 by 10 foot roll of cotton white cloth. U.S. textiles. No tariff, tariff of 50%. Okay, the tariff was higher than that, but we want to keep the math easy, right? So I'm altering the prices a little bit, once again, for easy math. So let's say the actual price was cheaper than this, but for that big roll of cloth in 1830, it was $1 to buy, you know, it's all for easy math. You happy? In the United States, it was actually, the difference was bigger, but we're going to give it the price of $1.20. Because it costs more to produce. What is that term where the bigger you are, you become more efficient? Britain had it. The U.S. didn't have it. So, you see why they might want a tariff. Because you put a 50% tax on it, what's the price of British textiles now? Make sense? Do you see why they want the tariff? So what's the price of American textiles now? What price will they charge? Can't they raise their prices now? That's why tariffs raise all prices. You raise the tariff, that allows American companies to raise their price too, because they're still going to undercut the British textiles. So the profit margins go up. And so this will raise the prices of all products, even ones made in the United States, and the money will flow up here. That is why companies like tariffs. Everyone understand how that works? A lot of things work like that too. Monopolies do the same kind of thing. You have a monopoly that allows them to raise prices when they drive out their competitors. Monopolies are taking advantage of the supply shortages to jack prices now. It's happening right now. So we're seeing the same thing now. So, but now we get to the big one. Yeah, that's an argument against the tariff, but is that enough really to threaten secession? No. Calhoun wanted to find an issue to unify the South. There are two political parties, the Democrats and the Whig, and they're national parties. He wanted to find a pro-slavery party, and he thought the tariff would be the issue. It would unify the South to protect slavery. And that, you got to put a star, underline it, banner it, whatever. The tariff isn't the big issue. It's the tariff as an issue to protect slavery, and therefore protect the minority section from the tyranny of the majority section. Remember, the populations are changing, and everybody's moving to the north. And if the federal government resists, we leave the Union. We will take our ball and go home. We'll blow it up. This is remind you of 1820 in Missouri. So they're threatening civil war just 12 years later. And by the way, everyone knows, if there's a state secedes, that's war. The United States is not going to allow a state to leave. Because if one state leaves, the whole thing will crumble. So secession equals war, and everybody knew it. So he's threatening war over the tariff of 1828. But don't forget this, slavery. And one more thing. Remember I told you Jacksonian democracy? Was it that the Constitution should expand democracy and not protect the power of a few members of the moneyed elite? That's what Calhoun's trying to protect. the minority big plantation owners. This is the exact opposite of Jackson. Exact. That's all that Calhoun is trying to protect, the wealth of a few moneyed elite who have these big slave labor camps. That's part of the reason why Calhoun really thought Jackson was an ally, because Jackson had one too. They're plantation owners. But Jackson believed in democracy. This is the fight. So it's one of those things where nobody really likes to talk about it, this nature about protecting slavery. They're talking about the tariff. They weren't going to go to war over a tax, but they were going to go to war over control. Remember the Key Act? It wasn't about the tax. It was about the monopoly. It was about control. And what is the word for power? Sovereignty. That's the war. So, over the next couple years, you have all these crises building up. Wow! We have the malaria. Jackson and Calhoun hate each other. Calhoun's vice president talking about destroying the Union. He doesn't want to destroy the Union. But his proposals will. Well, there was a debate called the Webster-Hayne debate in the floor of the United States Senate. And so we're thinking about the Senate, they would do anything this kind of regal and just now. I have a very low opinion of the Senate. Sometimes that comes out. Not individual members of the Senate. Some are perfectly fine. But so I get a little cynical about that. Well, there's an amendment to a bill called the Foote Amendment, and it was basically to stop the sale of cheap land. Senator Foote was from Connecticut, and he wanted to make the land here more expensive. Remember the land they're just opening up? Why? Because workers here, he wanted to make sure they couldn't go here. Because what would that do to wages here? If workers had no choice but to stay here and work in a textile mill, what does that do to wages? So this is a way to keep people there and drop wages. Well, Robert Hayne, senator from South Carolina. Gee, I wonder who else is from South Carolina. He got up, allied Calhoun, and said he went against this amendment. Why? He didn't care about cheap land. He's looking for allies. He wanted to ally with people here to protect slavery, the tariff issue. This was not planned. Daniel Webster, a young and up-and-coming Whig here, looks very dashing there, from Massachusetts, okay, relatively dashing. He got up and gave one of the greatest speeches in American history. He would become one of the most prominent Whigs, not because he was smart or noble, but he had a great speaking voice. And that's going to turn out to be more important, the ability to have an image, the actual substance of a person. I'm sorry, that's politics. But he gave a speech, and it turned into a fight against nullification, and therefore a fight against civil war. And he finished it with liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Great line. It's now the motto of North Dakota, but great line. Yeah, I know, is that weird? Oh, I didn't get to the toast. Okay, I'll get to it Monday. We'll finish this off. We got one more war to fight. By the way, Indian removal and this is where you get the contradictions of Jackson. The horrors of Indian removal, and yet he's also wanting to save the Union. Jackson's an interesting dude.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you tomorrow.
See you Monday.
Huh?
Monday. Not
The week flies by that fast for me.
See you tomorrow. We will. Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
See you Monday.
I'll keep you day tomorrow. And Amy, Monday for the book. Yeah.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Goodbye.
See you Monday. Tomorrow.
I keep saying tomorrow. I'll see you Monday.
Thank you, sir.
See you tomorrow. What's on your shirt?
Monday. They're
Off-road vehicle. Very
Yeah.
cool. And we got the overalls. We got the tie-dye. Nice sweater. And what's on there? That's very cool. All right. See?
Monday.
Very unique. I'll see you guys tomorrow. I know. I picked that one up first. Get in there and be quiet. You guys got work to do. Nutcracker? That's cracker. Okay, I get it. I had to put it together. That's pretty good. I like that. I'm shutting off the film, people. We're going offline. Anyone want to wave goodbye before I go? All right?
Nah.
You missed out.